Hello and welcome back. Chris here with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Remember, in these videos, we take 6 firearms that have come into our store either through our website or through the front door and give you guys a quick 2 to 3 minute review of each. Now, in this video, we start with the most common and move through the least common as the video progresses. So if that sounds interesting to you, please stick around. That's coming up now. All right, first up, we have one that comes to us from a customer in Pennsylvania. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Polish P83 Wesson pistol. It feeds from a detachable 8-round box magazine. It is a straight blowback design, chambered in 9x18 Makarov, and was used with the Polish armed forces between about 1983 and technically still being used today, but pretty much was being phased out by about the year 2000. Now, the story with this would actually begin back towards the tail end of the Second World War. And if a lot of you guys watched the last weekly used gun review video, you know I set up a studio at home, so I'm going to use some of my personal firearms to sort of illustrate the history of this design. Kind of starts here, and if we look at this pistol, the TT-33 Tokarev, it's chambered in 7.62 by 25 millimeter. It was a Russian design from Fyodor Tokarev, going into the Russian military in 1933. Now, part in the interwar period, Stalin had been working through an arms sort of revision program where he wanted to come up with new military technology, replacing the 1895 Nagant revolver with semi-automatic handgun technology like this, moving from the Mosin Nagant rifle to the SVT-38 and SVT-40 semi-automatic weapon systems. But by the time the Second World War would kick off, they would not have enough in production. So the SVT-40 and TT-33 were more ancillary firearms that were used to sort of be gap fillers in service. Now, as we're moving through World War II, towards the end of the war, Russia wanted to go to a smaller caliber. The 7.62 by 25 Tokarev is really a submachine gun round. It's a very high velocity bottleneck cartridge. They wanted to go with something that would be cheaper and easier to manufacture, something with a little bit more reliability. So they would actually implement a new arms revision program towards the tail end of the Second World War, and they would put out a solicitation for a new service sidearm. Now, this was put forward by Makarov. There were about, I want to say, 8 or 9 other submissions. I have a lot more. I'm trying to kind of gloss over these to give you some context for the P83 Wesson, but I have more detailed histories on these and other weekly used gun reviews. Now, this would actually win the design. It itself would take a lot of very heavy inspiration from the German, I'm going to bring in another one here, PP and PPK design. Now, these would be designed in Germany in the 1930s. They were very robust, very well-designed pistols in a low caliber, technically 32 automatic, and they had a fixed barrel and were a straight blowback design. Now, because of that, they had really good accuracy because you don't have the moving parts in here. The barrel stays fixed. So for its size, it's actually not very complex to manufacture, pretty cheap to make, very reliable and very accurate. So in Russia, with this concept, they wanted to take the principles of the PP and PPK out of Germany and put them into the more standard issue service sidearm. Now, the PP and PPK were more ancillary officers' models, if you will. The standard issue were the P38 and P08 Luger. But this is what Russia would land on. Now, through the Cold War era, a lot of other satellite countries would sort of take similar cues from the Makarov. They would either completely copy this design, the Makarov PM, or come up with similar operating systems, slightly different handguns chambered for the same round. And that is what Poland decided to do. Now, through the post-World War II conflict, bringing back the Tokarev TT-33, Poland was actually issuing this pistol. It was a copy or a licensed copy of the TT-33, chambered in the same round, the 7.62 by 25 millimeter. And this is what Poland was using through the 1950s into the early 1960s. But with the adoption of the Russian Makarov, Poland wanted to move into something similar. So in the 1960s, they would actually get to work on creating a copy of the Makarov, and they would land on this. This is the P64, mainly used for artillery crews and things like that. You'll see it's actually a very small handgun, pretty small in size for what you would typically consider a service sidearm. But you'll notice that, remember we took apart the PP here, the Makarov pistol as well as the P64 Polish pistols operate very much the same way. So you can see the design similarities here. Now, that gets us finally to the start of this segment, the P83 Wenad. So the P64 would stay in Polish service, of course, through the 60s into the late 70s. Now, one of the problems with the P64 is it was a little bit limited in capacity. It was only a 6-round capacity magazine. It was also very small, so because of that, it was very snappy and could be kind of difficult to control. Mainly issued to police and, again, artillery crews. They wanted something in the Polish armed forces that would be more standardized, a little bit larger, less unwieldy, easier to control with a higher capacity, also easier to produce. So they would actually get to work in coming up with this. Now, this would be designed in 1978 at the Ozrodek factory at Radom and would be ready for production in 1983 and would stay in production until about 2000. Now, this actually uses mostly metal stamping, so again, very easy to produce, but again, if we look, takedown lever is actually just a locking block inside the trigger guard, but you pull it back and it works very much the same way as the P64 or the, where'd it go? The German PP pistol. So again, very interesting design. Now, this itself would be replaced in 1994 in police and military service by the WIS 94 pistol, or in police service, more notably the Glock 19 handgun. So these have mostly been phased out by about the 1990s. That's when you would start seeing these come into the United States as military surplus and where you can actually buy them today. They have not gone up a whole lot in value over the past couple decades, really. You could typically pick one of these up between about $300 and $500, depending on condition, what they come with, and things like that. Circle 11 factory, this one made in 1987. So very cool pistol. Very happy to get this one in and share it with you. This is the Polish P83 Wenad. Okay, up next we have a very important piece of U.S. sidearm development and history. This one comes to us from a local customer. This is a Smith & Wesson Model 1917 military revolver, chambered in .45 ACP. It feeds into a 6-round capacity cylinder. You would typically use moon clips. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And it was actually manufactured along with Colt to be support and ancillary sidearm manufacturing for the First World War and even to a lesser extent beyond that into World War II. This is United States property marked as well, and I'll again get into those details. Now, because I'm home, I can show you other related firearms again, and the story is actually going to begin with the Colt 1911. This is actually a John Moses Browning design, designed through other earlier iterations, but landing on this design concept in about 1910, would be militarily adopted in 1911 and go into full-scale production between about 1912 and 1913. Now, World War I would kick off in 1914, so there was not a large time frame between implementation and deployment in the First World War. Therefore, there were not a whole lot of these to go around. Now, it is a fantastic semi-automatic design, actually the first that would be adopted by the United States military, also chambered in the .45 automatic. But because there was not enough of these to support the troops, the United States military would put out a solicitation for an ancillary supplemental sidearm that would also be chambered in the same round that could be issued alongside the 1911 to people in more support roles. This would be backline type personnel, cooks, mechanics, vehicle drivers, things like that, who may not have a higher chance of being involved in any type of military skirmish or combat, but in case they were, they would have this issued to them as opposed to nothing because, of course, again, the 1911, there weren't enough to go around. Now, when it comes to logistics of your ammunition and your firearms, you don't want to get away from having too few calibers. Typically, you want to stick with 2, maybe a maximum of 3 different types of calibers being issued to your military force. You get beyond that, logistics starts becoming an issue. You don't want a huge amount of firearms ending up in one location without ammunition to supply them. This is something that the Japanese routinely ran into in the Second World War because they had things like the 6.5 Japanese, the 7.7, the 7.7 rimmed, semi-rimmed, and non-rimmed. They had the 8mm Nambu, the 7mm Nambu. They had just a huge variety of different cartridges, and so logistics in those situations does become an issue. These would be manufactured, again, by Smith & Wesson and Colt. Colt themselves had already started working on a large frame revolver that they were easily able to convert into the Model 1917 design. Smith & Wesson would come up with this. If you actually look at the Model 1917 as named by Colt and Smith & Wesson, there are subtle design differences, so it's not like the M1 Carbine or the M1 Garand where they're identical across manufacturers with mostly interchangeable parts. The Colt and Smith & Wesson shared some similar features, but a lot of the design elements are actually a little bit different. So there's going to be some differences there between the two. These would go on to see service as well in the Second World War, again in a support role, typically carried by MPs, or about 20,000 units would go overseas to the European and Pacific theaters, but again, mainly used by occupational backline personnel, so not main issue combat. Now, the 1911 would serve on as the primary issue sidearm of the United States military from World War I to World War II to Korea and Vietnam, being replaced by the M9 Beretta in about 1982. So anyway, these are really interesting revolvers, and they are a legitimate, very important part of U.S. small arm design. It would actually be the last real service revolver issued by the United States military, save for the Victory model from Smith & Wesson in 38 that the United States military would actually ever see. So very cool. Again, United States property marked here, U.S. Army model 1917 on the bottom of the grip strap here. So original ones would have actually had just slab side wood grips. These are diamond pattern. These are likely replaced at some point. Could have been replaced around that time or slightly after the war when it was purchased as surplus, because it does give more texture to hold on to than the slab side wood panel grips would have. On the market today, these things have a very wide range in terms of value, anywhere from about $500 to $600 on the low end up to about $1,200 on the high end, depending on condition and matching parts and things like that. So anyway, very cool revolver. Very happy to get that one in and share it with you guys. That is the Smith & Wesson Model 1917 45 ACP service revolver. All right, up next we have one that comes to us from a viewer in New York. So big thank you for selling this one to us. This is a Romanian Romac 1762 by 39 AKM. And these would actually sort of start the story of the Wasser 10, the GP Wasser 10, the 1063s, and all of that have been coming into the country since the 1990s. Now, the story with this would actually begin in the mid-1980s when there is beginning to become a growing demand for a civilian semi-automatic AK or AKM variant on the U.S. commercial market. Now, some earlier entrants into this market would be companies like Steyr importing the Madi AKM, as well as the Valmet rifles from Finland. Now, both of these options are rather expensive, especially for the 1980s. I mean, we're talking about $1,500 plus for these rifles in 1980s dollars, when most of your other sporting arms at the time are in the $200 to $400 range. So what the public really wanted was a $300 to $500 AK or AKM. Now, a couple companies abroad, would actually answer the call, and they would be based out of China. They would be Norinco and Polytech. They would source AKs, semi-automatic AKs from the different plants in China and export them to U.S. importers into the United States through the mid to late 1980s. They were a really good, very functional option, again, in that $400 to $500 price point that most of your typical shooters in the market could afford. Of course, the Norinco and Polytech AKs are very expensive today because in 1989 there was an unfortunate event called the Stockton Schoolyard shooting in Stockton, California. This is where a nut job opened fire on a playground of children and used a Norinco Type 56S AK to do it. Because of that, then President George Bush Sr. would implement an importation restriction on non-sporting arms. These would be firearms that have a non-sporting purpose that could be no longer imported into the United States. Because of that, the cheaper AKs, the Chinese Norinco and Polytechs, could no longer come into the country. Now, in 1990, the Chinese AKs would be reconfigured to fit the sporting purpose clause into what was known as the MAC 90 AKs. Very similar, except had thumbhole stocks, no bayonet lugs, no threaded muzzles, and things like that. Now, to further exacerbate the squeeze on domestically available AKs, In 1994, President Bill Clinton would implement the famous, or infamous, I should say, 1994 assault weapons ban. This did have a sunset in 2004, but during this time, there could be no imported nor domestically manufactured firearms that have so-called evil assault weapon features, or more than a couple. These would be things like pistol grips, adjustable stocks, grenade launching mounts, grenade launchers, bayonet lugs, shrouded like heat shrouds and things like that. Shoulder things that go up, you guys get the point. Now again, because of this, the MAC 90s would stop coming into the country, so the AK market is left wide open. Now, what starts to happen is Kruger and Romania would start bringing in their AK variants during the assault weapons ban in 1997. Now, the earlier versions of those would be the Romacs like this and the WUMs. It would really depend on who the importer was and how they named it. But the Romac ones and the WUM ones would be the earliest that would come into the country, and they would be, what's actually really cool about them is they are 100% made by Kruger in Romania. Kruger is a military arms manufacturing plant in Romania. They've been manufacturing the Romanian military AKs for decades, so they are a sort of a military configuration and grade AKM pattern, and of course semi-automatic only. Now, because of the restrictions of the 94 assault weapons ban, they could have no bayonet lugs. The little ears here on the lug were machined off. They could not have a threaded muzzle. They did this in a couple ways. A, they either machined the threads off, or like it was done here, and more preferably, they put a muzzle nut over the threads and then tack welded it at the bottom. So if you now get one, you can cut the tack weld and take that off and put on a standard muzzle device. And they would import them with thumbhole stocks. Now, a previous owner of this one has since taken that off, put on a Romanian laminate stock. This looks almost like one of the modern Yugo US-made pistol grips. These likely were the furniture set that came with the firearm, sort of this blondish laminated wood, and left the muzzle nut intact. Appears to be in overall very good condition, but a lot of collectors of AKs, especially Romanian AKs, like the WUMs and the Romacs, because they are the most pure sort of version, especially when you sort of inhibit them, putting on original furniture and things like that, getting the threads back open. So the only feature that this would not have then is the bayonet wings here on the lug. Now, after the assault weapons ban, they would come out with the GP Wasser 10, GP for general purpose. That was when they would put the original stocks and pistol grips back on them, put the bayonet lugs on, and allow the muzzles to be threaded and left open for your use of muzzle device. That would happen in 2004 after the expiration of the assault weapons ban. The Wassers have still been made by Kruger, imported mostly by Century Arms ever since. The pricing, of course, has steadily increased over the years. They have US-made furniture and stuff on them today, but they are still regarded as a very good sort of entry-level foreign manufactured AK, and I think everybody with an AK collection should have a Romanian AK in it somewhere. Now, the Romacs and the WUMs, as mentioned, are a little bit more desirable because of their early entrance into the market, and they're more, you know, standard production, I should say, more similar to their military production made on Romanian, a lot of surplus military parts as well. And you're going to find them in about the $1,000 plus or minus range. The brand new, you know, by comparison, the brand new Wassers are about that same price on the market. So to find one of these at nearly the same price, I would totally go for one of these, especially if you're just into that sort of military collecting. So anyway, very cool rifle. Very happy to get this one and to share it with you guys. That is a Romanian Romac 1. All right, up next we have a very interesting and collectible rifle that comes to us from a customer in Illinois. This is a Daewoo DR200, which was the post-89 importation restriction version of the K2 rifle, which I actually have one here and I'll show you in a minute, the original K2. The story with this would actually begin in South Korea. This is the South Korean service rifle, which has been in use since about 1985 and is still being used today with some limited revisions. Now, in about 1972, South Korea is looking at advancing its armament. Now, keep in mind, prior to that, at the conclusion of the Korean War, the United States military had left South Korea with a bunch of old, sort of getting old or outdated at this time, World War II and Korean War type of equipment. This is M1 Garands, M1 carbines, M3 grease guns, 1919 machine guns. You guys get the point. Now, South Korea was interested in getting into their own arms development. Of course, as we're getting through the 1960s into the 1970s, there's a lot of arms development happening around the world, and South Korea can't really be caught with these sort of old, outdated rifles, especially with a growing threat just across the border to the north. So in 1972, South Korea would start their own weapons program. They would come out with a series of experimental rifles known as the XP-1, XP-2, XP-3, XP-4, and XP-5. Now, through this rifle platform, they were going to take cues from other similar popular designs at the time, mainly the M16. Now, being closely allied with the United States, South Korea had been looking at the advancement of the M16 rifle, which is actually being marketed and distributed by Colt at this time, and would later actually get into a licensing agreement for an M16 variant of their own, which I will get to in a minute. Now, during this XP program, there were two main factors of the weapon system that the South Koreans wanted to implement. They wanted it to be chambered in 7.62 NATO. One of the reasons for this is because of the 1950s and the 1960s, with things like the American adoption of the M14, the Spanish Set-Me-See, the German G3, the Belgian FAL, which is being adopted everywhere, and as the SLR L1A1 in Great Britain, you have other Commonwealth countries that are adopting the FAL. They wanted it to be in the standard NATO cartridge, which again is starting to get phased out by the 1970s. One other thing is that they wanted it to be direct impingement. Again, this is because of their close relationship and interest in the M16 platform. Now, they had seen some lukewarm success with these designs. The XP-1 through XP-5 did have limited success through field testing and trials, and there wasn't enough development and production available to actually get these into wide-scale use. Keep in mind, at the time, the South Korean Reserve Army alone was 1 million troops, so they had to quickly revamp and update their military. Through this trials program, they just did not have enough, and they didn't see their manufacturing capacity great enough to be able to meet the demand. So in 1974, they would actually license with Colt for a licensed copy of the M16. And now, South Korea would build the M16 rifle for just 1 year between 1974 and 1975. They learned a couple things here. Number one is licensing firearm manufacturing is expensive. So they could, with their budget for their military spending, they were not able to get nearly enough units to be able to supply the needs that needed to be met. Number two is they wanted to keep the not only the licensing, but the production rights and the manufacturing itself domestically at home in case of any type of global crisis or anything like that. If the United States is not able to provide aid or Colt pulls out of the licensing agreement, they could be in trouble. So because of this, they would go back to the drawing board. They would come out with 2 more experimental rifles subsequently after dropping the licensing agreement with Colt, and those would be known as the XP6 and XP7. Now, they made 2 big changes to the design. Number one is they would drop the interest of going to the 7.62 NATO and stick with the 5.56. By the late 1970s, this is what most countries are doing anyway. The other thing is they would go from the direct impingement designs of the M16 into a gas piston design, a short stroke gas piston. And through this, the XP6 and XP7, they land on more or less this design. Now, they would come out with a final design iteration of this known as the XP7C, later just being known as the XK2, X meaning experimental. And by 1982, the rifle would be ready for trials. Now, between 1982 and 1984, it would see a lot of field use and was massively successful. Very reliable, durable, and actually easier to produce. And if they could co-op with a large conglomerate manufacturer in South Korea at the time, Daewoo, they could actually get production out quick enough to support their infantry. So that is what they would do. Now, again, remember, post-Korean War, there was no domestic arms manufacturing in Korea and South Korea because the United States had been basically supplying the armament. So it was a very quick, actually, scaling up for a military arms design, implementation, and manufacturer in South Korea for the needs that they needed to be met. By 1985, this was officially adopted as the rifle. They would drop the X as experimental, just leaving it as the type classified K2. Now, as mentioned, this is still in service in South Korea. In 2013, they made a couple subtle revisions, like adding a bunch of rails to the rifle, making it able to accept lights, lasers, different attachments, optics, and things like that. But by and large, the South Korean K2 is the same that it has been since 1985. Now, at this time in 1985, as we just mentioned, talking about the Romanian AKs, the United States commercial market is very interested in getting foreign manufactured military type armament, and the K2 rifle would be no exception to that. So in about 1987, 1988, a bunch of American importers would bring in different versions of the K2. It's actually the K2 rifle, just semi-automatic. They would know this as the K2, the DR100, and the Max 2, depending on who the importer was. IAC, Stoeger, Kimber were a few of the importers, so just depending on who imported it, that's what the name was, but the rifles were the same. Now, 1989, again, because of that same importation restriction that we talked about when we looked at the AK, the 1989 George Bush Sr. sporting importation restriction, the K2 rifle, the AR-100 version, could no longer come in its military configuration, which was this. So basically you had a side folding stock. It's kind of hard to do upside down if I got this right. There we go, it goes down and over. Kind of this weird club shaped type stock. It had a bayonet lug here at the front, a birdcage flash hider, and that was basically it. Oh, and the pistol grip. Now, when they had to come in from that point, they couldn't have those evil military features, so it would actually have a thumbhole stock. Previous owner actually replaced it to a standard pistol grip and stock configuration, but this is non-folding. They had to get rid of the bayonet lug, but there is a pilot hole here, I guess, if you want to somehow attach one. And this one, I don't know if this is true on all cases, but this does not have vents cut into it. I can't recall. I've had a couple of the DR200s. I can't remember if those had standard bird cages on them or not. If this was replaced or original, I don't know. But I do know that the bayonet lug and the thumbhole stock were what was standard on the DR200. This one imported by Kimber. Now, these would come into the country as the DR200 with the limited features from 1989 to 1994, making them actually pretty uncommon. So on the market today, the DR200s are going to be in about the $1,200 to $1,600 range, somewhere in there, depending on condition and what they come with. The original K2s maybe in the 2,000 plus, so somewhere in there. So the non-manipulated K2s are a little bit more valuable, of course, because they have the original features and they're pre-banned. But anyway, very cool rifles. Always happy to get these in and share them with you guys. This is the DR200 post-89 restriction ban version of the K2. Okay, up next is a very interesting rifle that comes to us from a local customer. This is an HK UMP. More specifically, this is an HK USC that has been converted by Tom Bostic at Tommy Build into a UMP configuration. Let's first talk about the UMP. So if we go back to about the 1960s, 1966, HK would come up with a revolutionary new submachine gun called the MP5. Everybody who is even remotely familiar with firearms knows what the MP5 is. One of the most iconic firearms ever made, and is in fact still popularly used with militaries and police forces around the world today. Now, the MP5 is typically a 9mm, it's a lower caliber, so 9mm 40 Smith & Wesson submachine gun. It is a closed bolt and is similar to having this little charging handle on the left-hand side that you can give the, I'm trying to be a little careful, HK slap, did hold open, because the UMP has a hold open. And it's been a very, very successful submachine gun. Now, if we look prior to the 1960s, to the 1940s, 1950s, the military doctrine commonly shared around the world for submachine guns is that they would be used in frontline operations, typically with commanding officers or platoon or squad leaders, because of their ease of compact maneuverability, lightweight nature, and the fact that they can produce a high volume of fire at close ranges, being in a subcaliber like 9.45 ACP 7.62x25. You saw this commonly with things like the MP40 in Germany, the Thompson in the United States, the PPSH-41 and PPS-43 in Russia. Now, through the 1950s into the 1960s, the doctrine of submachine guns would actually change. Largely, they would be phased out from main frontline use. You start seeing development of things like the Uzi in Israel and the VZ61 in the current-day Czech Republic, or then Czechoslovakia. And submachine guns are still being used in more of a police military role, but for more tactical and specialized application. We're getting off the main lines of the battlefield. Most of those are being replaced by the intermediate cartridge rifles like AKMs and M16s later on. Or the full powered rifle cartridges like the FAL and the G3 and the M14 and things like that. Now, by 1966, when the MP5 would come out, this would seal the deal for the tactical use and application, special purpose built use submachine guns. So this is going to be counterterrorism. This is going to be special operations and military forces where small groups need to get in and out of potentially compact areas quickly, discreetly, and quietly, and being able to produce high volumes of accurate fire at close ranges. So the MP5 was actually stellar at this and has been used in that exact application ever since inception in 1966. Now, as mentioned, the MP5 was mainly in smaller calibers, 9 and 40 Smith & Wesson. HK wanted to take the success of the MP5, use more of a variety of higher impact, higher quality polymers, lightening the weight of the firearm, making it cheaper and easier to produce and able to accept larger calibers like the 45 ACP. And what HK hoped to gain is more adoption with foreign military and police, mainly with the United States. 45 through the 1990s was largely phased out, but still being used in select service roles, things like the 1911 still in service in some areas of the armed forces. So the United States would actually adopt the UMP. This gun would come out in 2000. It would be adopted again for very specialized military application in the United States as well as in Canada. But beyond that, the UMP has never really excelled or exceeded beyond nearly the successes of the MP5. Now, in the same year, 2000, HK would come out with a US commercial version known as the UMC. It was like the UMP, but it took only a single stack magazine. It had this large sporterized contraption stock on the back, and of course this longer 16-inch barrel, which this one still has. Now, a company known as Tommy Built, owned by Tom Bostic, which has been in operation for in excess of 10 years, has specialized in making civilian semi-automatic versions of the classic HK products, namely the UMP and the G36 rifles. Now, he does this in one of two ways. A is he actually has a domestically manufacturer that he produces US-made G36 and all the variations, the E, the K, the C, as well as the UMP in 9, 40, and 45. Which you could buy directly from him as an assembled firearm. The thing with that is because he is not HK, those do not have HK roll markings. They have his Tommy Built logos and things like that, which is no big deal. But for the purists, if you like the HK markings, what he can do is take the USC like this and actually do a UMP conversion. What he effectively does is he modifies the handguard with the 3 vent holes. You have to supply the parts, like this has a original UMP double stack magazine well, so you provide that and he puts it into the gun. And then he can do a back-end conversion one of two ways. He can graft on a demilled piece from a UMP or use a block, which has been done here, which accepts the traditional UMP stock, getting rid of that sporterized stock contraption. For the rear block conversion, I know his price is around $1,000 to do the conversion. If you want to graft on an actual UMP rear receiver section and give it the 100% authentic UMP look, that's about $1,500, I believe. I don't know if his pricing has changed. And then he could do an SBR for you and cut the barrel, or you can get the gun like this with its 16-inch barrel and do an SBR yourself if you want to do that. It's actually this pin right here just gets knocked out. Barrel comes out through inside the receiver. You can buy UMP barrels and put them in, and replace that roll pin. Very easy thing to do, no head spacing required. So really cool SBR project if you want to go that route too. USCs are about, what, $1,500 or so. So for the full-on conversion without sourcing the parts and all of that, you're at about $2,500 plus, maybe into $3,000 after you do all the part sourcing for this type of build. And for a full conversion, you're maybe into it for $3,500 or so. And then if you want to do SBR, then you have your Form 1 tax stamp and the barrel. Barrels are about $300 last I checked. So they can get up there pretty pricey for like $4,000 if you want to do full on SBR. But very, very cool. His Tommy Built, now since the brace thing happened, he sold them with braces, but now can just do a pistol. 100% new parts made by him, so you can look at that as well. So anyway, very cool firearms. UMPs are still around today in some select military and police service. And of course, there is the commercial offerings like this. Cheaper versions also, Gideon did one, a cheap clone. It's maybe around $1,500 or so you can get that as well. Anyway, very cool firearm. Happy to get that one and share it with you guys. That is an HK UMC conversion to UMP. Okay, last but not least is one that comes to us from a local customer, actually the same one who sold us the UMP you guys just saw. This is an HK SL8 converted to G36E configuration, set up as a DMR, designated marksman's rifle, on the HK G36 pattern, again through the help of Tom Bostic. Now, If we look at the G36 in general, the story would actually begin in around the 1970s. Now, at this time, most of the world is moving into an intermediate cartridge rifle. This would be true in the United States with the 5.56. Of course, a lot of the comp block nations with the 7.62x39. You have the Steyr development of the AUG. Ireland and Australia keeping in line with that as well. So everybody's moving into an intermediate cartridge. Now, at this time, of course, we still have a division between Eastern and Western Germany, and we have the localized German government military of the Bundeswehr, which is using a full-powered rifle cartridge in their, the G1, I'm sorry, the G3, G1 later to the G3. The G1 was an FAL variant in 308, and then later into the Ludwig von Gremmler designed G3, which was also in 7.62x51mm NATO or 308. So full-powered rifle cartridge. Now, HK, which is one of the leading arms designers or developers around this time in Germany, was working on a very new design known as the G11. It was very much thought outside the box, had a proprietary type of ammunition, a caseless ammunition, and was taking a lot of time in terms of R&D. Now, everybody was sort of thinking that the G11 would be finally militarily adopted as the standard issue rifle and sort of an intermediate caliber for Germany, but in the late 80s, early 90s, a wrench would be thrown into those cogs when you have a unification of Eastern and Western Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, what Germany, the Ministry of Defense, had decided on at this time is, hey, let's scrap this weird experimental arms design that has been happening, and let's focus more on a standardized, military rifle that will use the NATO 5.56 to bring it back to basics and come out with something. Well, HK, again, who wanted to get a military contract, have been spending so much time in R&D with the G11, they quickly came up with a new design which actually would start seeing a lot of promise, and this was through the early 1990s, which they knew as the Model 50. Now, this would take mostly this type of shape and design concept. It was mostly made out of high-impact reinforced polymers where you have metal in the critical areas such as the barrel, trunnion, bolt carrier, charging handle, and places like that. The receiver was mostly made of the polymer, the stock's made of polymer, the handguard's polymer. So it was lightweight, easy to produce, very inexpensive to manufacture, and was chambered in the 5.56 round using its own proprietary magazine like this, kind of this smoky black, and the magazines could be coupled. Now, interestingly enough, this would be officially adopted in Germany in 1997 as the standard configuration E pattern, or the E barrel length. This is kind of the rifle barrel length like this. They would subsequently come up with the K and the C models, which is more of like a commando and a carbine versions for smaller, compact special operations or specialty use. But the main general infantry rifle was the full-length rifle size like this. Now, this would actually look, and I happen to have one here, more like this configuration. So you're going to see this UMP style skeletonized stock. There's the clamped magazines I was talking about. Full barrel length. Now, this is in the pencil profile, which is how they were issued with the bayonet lug. This does not have that, and I'll explain a little bit why. Now, this was actually a HKSL8. That is a civilian export version of the G36, which HK has been bringing into the country for a little while. But again, it's going to have a very long, heavy profile, non-threaded barrel, sort of this weird front end, a sporterized back end, single stack magazines, just kind of a goofy looking rifle, which kind of sort of looks like a G36. But what Tom Bostic does at Tommy Built is he can either take your SL8 and do a conversion like this if you want the genuine G36 HK row markings, which are on this rifle with the HK serial numbers on the bolt and the production codes, which is really cool. And he can do a conversion to a G36, taking the standard G36 mags. He can do the rear end conversion to the standard skeletonized stock, which I just showed you. He can put in this standard pencil profile barrel, which I just showed you on the other one. So you could either do the build conversion like that, or he manufactures, again, a purpose-built, fully manufactured here in the United States version of the rifle, which actually this is mine. It comes with just an accessory rail, but I got this export version of the optic just to kind of complete the look. But of course, it has all the Tommy Built TG36 row markings. He cannot put HK on his guns. The reason that this has HK markings is because this is an HK manufactured SL8 that he converted. Now, the previous owner of this opted to do a DMR type of build, keeping the heavy barrel but having it threaded and this really nice muzzle brake put on it. put in a Geisley trigger here, and then did a conversion on the back end of the rifle to put on a more precision stock. Germans didn't really have a version of this. I'm sure that they probably built some things like this for the designated marksmen, but they had the PSG-1 at that time for like GSG-9 and for special purpose use. So a 5.56 special built heavy barrel like this. I'm not sure if militarily they had anything like this that was standard issue. I don't believe that they did, but this is kind of like an interesting concept build done by the former owner. So really, really nice, fantastic trigger, heavy barrel. I am sure that this thing is accurate. I know that other people have done builds like this. Tom Bostic has done these sorts of things, and I know people get sub-MOA accuracy out of them. So they're just kind of a cool, different thing for the German G36 collector with HK roll markings on it. So on the market today, I mean, you can go look at Tommy Build's website. His from the ground up built E models, like the one that I own that I showed you, are in excess of $3,000. To do an SL8, the version, the SL8 brand new, is about $1,500 or $1,600. To do the conversion is probably at least $2,000 or $3,000, and you have to source the parts for him to be able to convert it as well. So, which is expensive and difficult to find. So, very, very cool rifle. Happy to get in that set of converted HK, the UMP, and the G36 for you guys to see, and that will end up this video. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on this. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button, and please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you know when we are posting more content. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris. You are watching Marksman TV, and we will see you next time.